Hi, welcome to the sixth episode of the Javid Podcast. Today, my guest is Dr. Natalie Ma. Hi, Dr. Ma.
Hello, hello.
We have a hopefully very interesting discussion around biotech and entrepreneurship. And before I delve into questions, I'd like to give a chance to Dr. Ma kind of give a brief introduction. Actually, take your time, give us introduction, tell us about your educational and professional background, and then we can start with the questions.
Of course. And I'll try to be quick about this because you have a lot of great questions, Javid. So I'm Natalie. I got my PhD at Yale. I currently head up business development at a company called Deep Origin, where we're building tech to predict biology and how biological systems work. But long term, have a goal of building biotechnology for space travel. So a lot of the things I have done are a means to an end to when I get to that point in the future, when it's reasonable and feasible to actually build biotechnology to help humanity survive and thrive in space, I actually have the skills to do it. So that's sort of like me in a nutshell. Got the PhD, loved the work, and happy to talk about sort of that and my path from the PhD on the podcast.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Actually, we're going to talk about the Deep Origin too, hopefully towards the end of the episode. But, let's start with your educational background. Dr. Ma, you did your PhD at Yale. So could you please start by sharing some insights, into your academic journey? I understand you began with a focus more on environmental sciences at UCLA, and then you did your PhD in molecular biology at Yale. So kind of what inspired this transition, or did your interest in environmental sciences kind of continue to influence your research at Yale as well?
Yeah. So I went from environmental science in undergrad to PhD at Yale in a different science because I was kind of mad about my sort of undergrad work in environmental science.
Oh.
So environmental science, for some sort of history of science context, in like the early 2010s was very anti-science. You had a group of people who, honestly, at least at UCLA, felt that like science and technology could do no good. Science was, racist, sexist, all the ists, and was being used as a way to sort of push the Western industrial way of thinking onto others or to oppress others. And for me, science was a way of thinking. It was, objective of all of these things. And I was like, this is a way of understanding the world to help better the world. And yes, people can misuse it, but it in itself is intrinsically not one of these things. So when I got my degree at UCLA and I was exposed to this, like I'd done a very strong science track with a minor in conservation biology. So I was doing tropical marine biology, which was incredibly depressing because we would go out to the reefs and be like, all the reefs are declining and all the species are declining in number. And like, we've already lost this much species diversity. And I was like, this is not, I don't think any way you slice it, you can't go back to the sort of ideal world before there being a technology released to some primitive Edenic state where we all live on subsistence agriculture. Because this was literally a thing someone proposed to me. I was like, you have to starve a huge number of people. And so I was like, no, I'm going to actually go and build biotechnology to help solve environmental problems. And so I didn't quite know what I wanted to do. I actually was listening to Radiolab, another podcast that I highly recommend out of WNYC, and they interviewed George Church on one of their podcasts. And he talked about sort of creating biofuels with algae. And I'd been doing undergrad work in plant science. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I want to do. I'm going to become a synthetic biologist. I went to my undergrad PI and she was like, don't apply to Harvard. I went to grad school there. It was intense and like really hard on women. And I was like, okay, I'll apply to all the other places. Ironically, George is at Harvard. And ended up at Yale because one of Farron's students or postdocs out of George's lab, like one of George's postdocs, Farron Isaacs, is at Yale as a synthetic biologist. And so that is how I sort of made the jump from undergrad degree in environmental science to PhD at Yale. I came in, I should say that out of the 9 grad school programs I applied to in molecular biology, genetics, etc., 7 rejected me, including MIT, UCSF, Berkeley. So Yale was one of the 2 that actually accepted me. And it was very much predicated on this. You had never had biochemistry. You'd never had some of these classes that were sort of core to molecular biology curriculum. Yale sort of interviewed me and was like, you'll figure it out. Take it your first year. It'll be fine. And it worked out great. So I do feel always very grateful that Yale sort of made that sort of decision on a whole person basis instead of just a sort of resume or core curriculum.
Yeah, that's very interesting how you decided to make that switch. And I guess, some people really like research, some people really like sciences. That's why they decide to pursue research, PhD, right? So looking back, right, reflecting on your past obtaining a PhD, do you think would you choose this route again, or do you think would like if so, like are there any aspects you would approach differently based on your experiences? Like would do differently?
Yeah, that's a great question because I think it's one that every PhD asks at some point in their PhD career, usually in like the dark third year or like in the sort of fourth and fifth years, the sort of the latter half, when the joy is worn off a little bit or the enthusiasm and the hard reality is setting in. I would 100% do my PhD again. So I had an amazing PhD experience. Were there ups and downs? Yes. Were there things that failed? Yes. Were there things that I could have done better? Yes. I do think if I were to do it again, I would have probably gone in with a deeper awareness of how much income I was deferring. Because I think a lot of folks in the PhD program come out the other end and are like incredibly excited just to be offered any six-figure job. I do think that you defer enough income that on the other end of that, you should be considering or expecting a higher, like a fairly high salary there, and not be incredibly grateful just to get any six-figure job, but get something that you find actually rewarding and valuable. Economics and supply and demand will determine that. It's just one thing I think people should consider more broadly when they say go, no go on the PhD. It's like, what is my long-term goal? When I always ask people when they sort of ask for information or advice, and then how, if at all, does the PhD fit into that? Can you achieve it without going and getting the PhD? Are there other means to the end? Things I would have done differently, Javid. That's a good question. I said, I would have considered the sort of economic impact of it more. The other thing I would do is consult on the side. So this is something that was not done as frequently when I was a graduate student, but I encourage most graduate students now to do this. If you are a technical expert in something, whether that's a methodology, whether that's, a disease, getting involved with whether that's a biotech company, whether that's a VC looking for diligence help, whether that's any range of things, even if it's not for what you think of as like the biggest sum of money, gets you valuable industry experience. And generally, you should get paid for that. There are a few exceptions where it's like you're just starting out, you might work for free for one, maybe two of them, but like you should pretty rapidly accrue enough experience where you're like, I'm going to do some work with you and you should value me appropriately. And it's one of the reasons that in both, let me double check this. I think this is true in the interns I've hired or consultants I've hired. I've always compensated them in some way. Because I think as grad students, we get into this habit of like, oh, my time is not valuable. Or like, oh, it's not worth a lot because I work 80 hours a week in lab, and that should not be the case.
I see. It's actually a very interesting point, and I feel like right now we're seeing like more and more PhD students like being either VC fellows or like doing things on the side. But I guess looking back in your time, right, beyond the academic research, how do you think, like, how did you yourself enrich your experience during graduate school? And could you share like some of the most memorable moments or activities that you were involved in that perhaps even define your career progression later on, right? During grad school.
Yeah, of course. There's quite a few of them. So I had a different extracurricular activity every year at Yale. And I do remember Farron being like, Natalie, I think you should focus, like buckle down and focus on your research. Because we're out on West Campus. For those not familiar with Yale's campuses, they're sort of the main campus and the medical campus, which are both in New Haven. And then you have West Campus over here, like two towns over that you get on a 20-minute bus ride to get to. So it's not exactly the most geographically easy to do like an extracurricular while doing all of your lab work on that campus. But I see my first year, I did all of my extra coursework, and then I was also, what was my second job my first year? Maybe that was all I did the first year. But the second year, I was a resident coordinator at Helen Hadley, and I was doing the PhD, and I started getting involved with Yale iGEM because Farron was the PI, like professor for Yale's Internationally Genetically Engineered Machines competition, which if you've done like a solar car project over the summer as an undergrad or something like that, it's the equivalent but for genetic engineering or for like a research project in synthetic biology. Third year, I was at the Writing Center helping put on sort of writing workshops, the Graduate Writing Center, and still an iGEM or still mentoring iGEM students. I think at that point I was now lead mentor for the iGEM team. Fourth year, still an iGEM, but then got involved in the Yale Graduate Consulting Club. And then from there, I think YGCC for the subsequent year, and still, I think I'd rolled off iGEM by fifth year. But sort of I had done different things to try and get my feet wet. In particular, the key ones were just seeing budgets somewhere, whether that's at Helen Hadley as a resident coordinator, or whether that was at iGEM for funding, like just seeing how the rest of the work was done besides science. And then for YGCC, it was very much work preparation for business. Like, because I sort of looked down the line, and when I realized I didn't want to become a faculty member, I was like, well, if my long-term goal is to build biotech for space travel, and I had gotten very good advice from a mentor, Drew Endy, who's at Stanford, who I met because I went for a mushroom foray at a Gordon conference. So yeah, go to your Gordon conferences. They're excellent ways to meet people. He advised, like, you probably want to go into startups. Like, that's the fastest way to translate innovation out of academia into the real world. It's not an experience you're going to have necessarily while you're a student or even a faculty in academia. The timeline is just so long. And so I knew I'd wanted to sort of go into the business side of things. I was looking for a way to do that, and consulting provided that springboard.
Mm-hmm. And out of all of them, which one was your favorite? Which one do you think was like the most helpful in terms of, I guess, the skill, knowledge, or just direction wise?
Yeah, and so like in terms of immediate like visible application, it was probably Graduate Consulting Club. And there are similar things now. Like the Yale has the Canaan Fellowship, which is through Canaan Ventures. So that's like Aaron Duffy was there. Tim Shannon, the Tim's phenomenal. And then there is actually a couple of other venture capital firms, I think, that now also offer fellowships. There's the Blavatnik Associates program. We work directly with the Blavatnik Fellows. So it's these sort of fellowship slash sort of like business exposure type roles where it's like you see not just the science of how things get done on the R&D side, but also these more strategic decisions that get made to impact what science is actually worth spending, what I will describe as a astronomical amount of capital to bring an innovation to patients. Because there's very little in biology that doesn't take a huge amount of capital to make an impact.
I see. And so you made your transition to industry pretty quickly, I guess. But, I looked at your kind of profile. You have pretty impressive, PhD research background, but did decide to make a swift transition from academia to industry. Was this always your plan? And how do you navigate this significant change? And what advice would you give to others contemplating a similar move? Because I feel like you come across like PhD students who kind of realize they're like, oh, academia is not for me, kind of late towards the end of their PhD, and they're kind of lost, right? So what can you do to navigate this process as smoothly as possible,
Yeah, a good question. I think the first thing would be sort of thinking about it roughly your third year. I feel like you don't have to decide that you won't be in academia your third year, but at least start thinking about what are some alternatives. Even in your second year, as I said, like I was trying out different things each year, and I felt like that was sort of it was my privilege to do, provided I got my lab work done, right? And so this is something that you negotiate with your PI, and every PI is different. Mine and like Farron again encouraged me to sort of focus on research, but he never sort of put strict limits on this. I remember when I did my fourth and fifth year, actually, I have to walk something back. One of the most impactful, if not the most impactful thing I did while I was at Yale was take Zoe Chance's Influence and Persuasion class. So I had signed up for this class because I had thought it was actually a different course on negotiation, business negotiation. I was like, oh, I'm quite bad at negotiation. I have to get better at it. I signed up for this one instead by accident, and ended up being probably one of the most life-changing things I'd ever done. So it's a single half semester course offered, I think, every fall. Zoe still offers it. Took it. It's a practicum. So you go out and try to negotiate the price of a car. You go to a random street and like ask someone for $20, right? The goal is to get really comfortable with uncomfortable asks. Great program. Zoe has actually now written a book called Influence is Your Superpower, which is the course in a book format. Like, again, I highly recommend people sort of just like read it, actually do the things in it, because they make you a better negotiator. But that was the most impactful thing. And I may or may not have just not told the DGS that I wanted to take. I sort of said, hey, here's a paper. Can you sign it? He was like, oh, okay. Signs it. It's like, well, I'm surprised Farron's letting you take the course. And I was like, yep, I hadn't told Farron. But paper got signed. I loved the class so much, and then Zoe liked me so much, I actually TA'd it the next year for extra money.
Yeah,
So again, love that course. Sorry to walk back the
that'll be fine.
sorry YGCC, you're also very amazing and very useful, but both of those things were pretty instrumental. Now to your current question, which refresh my memory on what it is.
It's why. So you made your transition to the industry pretty quickly. So my question was like,
Yes.
was this your plan, all the way through, or did you kind of at
No.
some point decide? And
Oh
why did you
no.
decide to leave academia, right? Like, why? What
Yeah.
was your reasoning, and what you can do to navigate that process?
Smoothly, yes. There's probably no 100% smooth pathway, although I will say management consulting and sort of through YGCC or Yale's Graduate Consulting
Mm.
Club or any consulting club is probably one of the smoother paths, and I'll explain why in a second. But I came in 100% like I'm going to become a professor. Like my dad got a PhD in math. I'm going to go to PhD school and then I'm going to become a professor and like teach and do research the rest of my life. I was actually thinking about this recently, and I think the catalyst for change was I think in my third year. So I was funded by DARPA to do this project that functionally was like a Jurassic Park type problem, where it sort of blended my love for environmental science with creating technological solutions to environmental problems. So you have lots of people are worried about GMOs for reasons that I don't think are very likely to be important. One of the things we do actually worry about is horizontal gene transfer. So you engineer something and you put it out in an open environment. It doesn't always work as expected because you actually have transmission of genetic information between this engineered system that you've sort of tuned and the natural world that's all around the system. And so one of the things you were concerned about was sort of what I like to call the Jurassic Park problem of how do you put something out in an open environment and have it work as expected instead of it going haywire, either releasing DNA that something else picks up and becomes problematic, or it in itself getting destabilized by DNA, a virus or something else, changing its properties, and you don't know what will happen. So we had done this project. There's an early prototype that got created of this organism called the genomically recoded organism. And I was like, oh, cool, we're going to be able to put it out in an open environment, do some field testing. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens. And my PI, and I think also DARPA, I don't actually know if they officially weighed in on this, were like, hell no. I was like, oh, well, maybe like, what time do you think you'd want to do this? Like, I understand there's some security risk associated with it. And they were like, maybe in like 20, 30 years. And I was like, oh, this was not what I expected for the PhD. So I think it was that point in which I had my conversation with Drew. I had mentioned Drew Endy earlier. He was at a Gordon conference in synthetic biology. He and I went on like a break walk, like mushroom foray through Sunday River. And he did the young graduate student, what are you doing with your life? Like, what do you want to do? And I was like, I told him about this. I told him about, I think it's important humanity goes to space. Just as sort of a belief that sentient life should probably expand in the universe, although there are some questions and issues with that as well. And he's like, well, why don't you build biotech for space travel? We're going to need it. And I was like, oh, how do I do that? He's like, well, startups are a good way to start. Transfer innovation out of academia. So I sort of came back from that Gordon where it's like, yeah, okay, I'm gonna do this. And that's how I got involved in YGCC and went on to the business side of things.
I see.
Now,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah.
Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, like, when you talk about handling the transition smoothly, going back to consulting is, I think, a pretty common way to do it because consulting is almost like a halfway point between the academic world and pure industry. So management consulting, as I'm talking about it, is you get a bunch of people who are domain experts or quite smart, and you throw them at business problems that businesses, either because they don't have the resources and bandwidth to handle, don't have the internal expertise because they haven't seen enough projects, or the third one is don't have the interest to do because no one wants to take it on because they're like, this question sucks. Throw it to a consulting firm. And so the consulting firms are all like really smart. Someone probably 20, 30 years ago figured out you could hire PhDs in addition to MBAs. And the MBAs probably negotiated more intensely than the PhDs did. The PhDs were like, oh my gosh, you're going to give me how much money? So they were like, oh, okay, we can hire all these PhDs. Now all the major firms hire PhDs. They hire them on an academic cycle. So there's a prep part of the cycle, and then there's an interview season. And so it fits in really well with the academic system. And so I think it's actually a very good pipeline if you are not sure of what you want to do next in terms of like business, but you want to do something that is not academia. I think it's a place that closes no doors because you can always go back and do the postdoc. No one's going to stop or not take you because you haven't pipetted for 2 years.
Mm.
Versus I think if you know you don't want to do the PhD, or you don't want to stay in academia and you go on and do the postdoc, unless you have a really clear reason for doing so, it can be harder to make a next jump.
Oh, interesting. I believe you did a stint in consulting yourself, as you said. I think it was year long, I believe.
Yeah, a year and 3 months.
Year and 3 months. And what were your impressions of the industry, both kind of positive and negative, and also kind of what prompted your departure, and in what ways do you think that experience contributed to your career progression? As you said, it's very valuable. It's kind of like a transition point between academia to industry. But how do you think it enriched you particularly?
Yeah, good question. So like I said, I sort of went from academia to consulting, knowing it was a means to an end. And lots of people do this. Consulting is definitely a place where you'll find that they often have this like idea of up or out, which is like you either get promoted each year or you get booted. And it sounds very hostile and terrible, particularly I think in the context of academia, where like you have a comfortable little nest behind your desk where you will spend the next 6 years of your life formulating ideas and testing them. And there's sort of like this infinite time component to it. Consulting seems very antithetical to this. That up or out thesis is actually very self-selected. Like people will self-select to leave, and very rarely, I'd say, are they fired. And that's because I think there's this tacit agreement that consulting is intense and it's hard and you will learn a ton and you work a ton of hours. But in return, I like to sort of say like I got a fake MBA out of it. Like I got essentially MBA training while getting paid. So my decision to sort of go into consulting was very much I'd spend 4 or 5 years there. I would learn a ton about business. I would build a ton of connections. That's the other thing the firms do is they have alumni networks. And so after that, I would exit and sort of go to the next thing, probably biotech, cut my chops in building businesses or biotech startups. And then I would go on to space after 2 or 3 different rounds of biotech startup, because you look at the broad landscape of people who are in space and all of them de-risk themselves on other companies first, right? Some of them massive companies. So it's really the only way you can de-risk to an investor, like here's this insanely hard space to go into. Here is like all the ways I've mitigated your risk that are not related to technical risk, essentially, or market risk. So I went to Clearview. They were phenomenal. Like I loved my time at Clearview, and I went in attending. Okay, I'll do 3 to 5 years. I'll make it to engagement manager. There's a very clear hierarchy in consulting firms. It's one of the great questions to ask firms is sort of like, well, what is the hierarchy? Like, what are the criteria they promote on? They're all culturally slightly different, so you'll get different sort of responses for each of them. Like I said, I went to Clearview. I loved the people. Like they were amazing to work with. They were so smart. We were mostly PhDs. We were an intense nerd culture. It was like the partners were all very thoughtful. I learned so much from them. And I had sort of an intent to stay, like I said, 4 to 5 years. Then it sort of became 3 to 4. And then sort of at the end of the first year, I was very frustrated because one of the problems with consulting is you are not in the game, which means you do this project. So for those who are unacquainted with consulting, you are put on this project on a time limited basis, usually between a couple weeks to a couple of months in strategy consulting and healthcare. For larger firms like BCG, McKinsey, Bain, you will end up on a project for anywhere between, I don't know, a few months to like years, even for the same project. So it sort of varies. But you do this project, it's pulled from the pool of people. So you work with your coworkers, and then the project is done, and then they dissolve the group, and you get released back to the pool, and then you get picked up for your next project on a different client. You often never find out what happened with that project. So you work this 60, 80-hour work week, which again, intense, but I think great learning experience. You'll see all this stuff. You get really invested in like this asset that they'll often ask you, like, should we go or no go on this program? Like we have this program in I don't know, in cystic fibrosis. Should we continue this forward given the landscape? And you do this research around the background, the current pipeline, all the competitors' assets, unmet need in patients. You give this presentation, and then you just will often not hear anything. Like your role's done. And so you never are in the game. You make this recommendation. Your client is the one who then goes and decides what to do. And that drove me crazy. I was not a huge fan of that. There was some attempts to like sort of mitigate that. You'd hear from some of the engagement managers who had longer relationships with the client, like, oh, the client decided to do this or that. So that was helpful. And there were some projects I worked on where it was like, it's for biotech startup in particular. They'd be like, you just set our strategy for the next 10 years. This is amazing. Thank you. But by and large, it was really hard to sort of feel like, okay, there's a reward at the end of this. So I got drinks with a really close friend of mine at Little Donkey, which probably still exists in Cambridge. I was like, this is Hamdi Cavusoglu. So he's not too far from you in New York. He's one of the directors now at Merck Digital Sciences Studio. But at the time, he was running Academic Venture Exchange, which was this nonprofit that matched seasoned entrepreneurs with sort of academic teams looking for biotech expertise. And so like the idea is that person would be the CEO and like sort of help spin the company out. And he's like, well, you know, they have this program at Yale where you graduated from that you just sit in the tech transfer office and spin out startups instead of out licensed technology. And I was like, what? No, I want this. And so he's like, yeah, go apply. So I applied, got in as a Blavatnik Fellow, and that's how I sort of made the jump into entrepreneurship or startups. A little earlier than I expected, with apologies to the folks at Clearview.
So after Clearview, you went to do the Blavatnik Fellowship, right?
That's right, yeah.
So it's a very prestigious fellowship, and it's focused on entrepreneurship. Is it mostly focused on biotechnology, or is it also involving other kinds of technology?
Excellent question. I think the Yale one almost exclusively focuses on biotechnology, although I ended up helping out with a couple of other projects as well. So biotech, medtech, digital health. Rich Anderson, who's one of the BDs at Yale, also did some ag stuff, and I helped him lightly there. And like I think I talked to a couple of tech folks. The focus is very much like bio related or healthcare related.
So can you just like give us an overview of the fellowship, what it entailed, and your activities during that time, how it benefited you in the long term, and additionally, what advice would you give to the aspiring, the scientists that want to secure that fellowship? What they can do to improve their profile to be competitive for that fellowship?
Yeah, so the fellowship is a 1-year fellowship. And for those of you who are not familiar with tech transfer offices, you have these folks called the business development officers or BDs who will sit within your tech transfer office when you have a disclosure and invention. Say you invent something, they show up with this form and you fill it out before you publish your paper, and then it disappears into the ether as far as you're concerned as a student. What you don't see is if in the back end, your PI and that BD are working to fill out the invention disclosure, file the IP, and then that business development person will go out to the world and try to out-license that. Go to, Eli Lilly, hey, do you want this technology? We know it fits with this thing over here. Hey, do you want this thing over here? We know it fits with this strategy you have, AbbVie or something. A lot of them are ex-biotech and pharma folks themselves. So they are great people to also apprentice yourself to. Like they're often very under-resourced because tech transfer offices don't have infinite money. They're tied to academic institutions whose mission is primarily education and research. So when you show up and say, hey, I want to help you do, some work on something, I think most tech transfer office BDs will be like, oh, that's great. Here's some stuff for you to do while learning. And Yale's offices were one of the offices that did allow that. So a lot of the BDs took on students as apprentices. So that's sort of the BD world itself. Now, the Blavatnik Fellowship was stood up really interestingly by this guy named Len Blavatnik. I think he's Ukrainian Israeli or Russian Israeli multi-billionaire. Has a large sum of money, which is why there is an Oxford school at Oxford, University of Oxford, dedicated to him.
Yeah.
And he gave Yale money because he wanted to build an entrepreneurship program that gave people sort of a step forward or a leg up. Like, okay, you are interested in this space. You don't necessarily come from a situation where you'd have connections or context to it. Like say your faculty member wasn't super translational. How do you get experience in this? And so they stood this up as a fellowship where you sit next to those BD folks I talked about in the tech transfer office. But the faculty comes in and is like, hey, I want this to be a startup, or does this make sense to be a startup? And so you'd evaluate, and if the answer sort of came back yes, or the faculty was like insistent, instead of out-licensing the technology to another company, you would actually start building a startup around it. And so it's a year-long fellowship where you sit in the tech transfer office and do everything from help build pitch decks and figure out business strategy, figure out market sizing, to pitching to investors, to figuring out budget spreadsheets, to figuring out operations, to finding lab space. It was sort of like whatever needed to get done. was like now your job. And because you work, at least in the Yale program, on multiple projects with multiple faculty. So in the fellowship, I worked with 8 faculty and got like 4 startups launched, and then a 5th one launched later. Like you get to see startups at all these stages with all these different, for lack of a better word, problems, right? It's like this one, the VCs don't believe that it won't be toxic. This one, the VCs think that you really need to reassess the market and number of patients. It's like everyone is at a different stage. And that gives you, I think, a lot more experience than if you were to go directly into one and then just sort of see that one. So I'll pause there. Definitely happy to answer follow-up questions on the fellowship because, like, again, I thought it was an amazing experience.
Yeah. It sounds very interesting. And, like to secure that fellowship, is it mostly like as they look at your like previous industry experience? Do they look at your like research output? What do they look at? What do they focus on,
Yeah. So that's a great question, actually. Let's see. So the main thing I remember when I was a fellow was we wanted folks with some kind of industry experience, right? So like management consulting was a great one because you could go out and do the consulting, do it again for like a year, 2 years, and then come back with a pretty broad understanding of how to like run opportunity assessments on like, okay, is this worth taking forward? Do a, due diligence on, how good an asset is or an acquisition of a company or all these things. And those are all skills that are broadly transferable to entrepreneurship or to startups. Other people had backgrounds that, like, the thing I love about the Yale program, again, I think it's unique to Yale, is that they took people from all walks or all backgrounds. So like my co-fellows, one came from another tech transfer office. One came from clinical operations. So near you on Med Campus, there's a group called the Yale Center for Clinical Investigation that runs a bunch of phase 1 studies for cancer talks. Like literally that's what they do. And so he had come from an operating group in there and had like a master's in public health. And then we had one person who had previously started a company in the chemistry space, in green chemistry, but wanted to get into biotech now. And so we had sort of a diversity of different backgrounds that helped us teach each other. For example, when I was a fellow, I taught folks how to do an opportunity assessment because one of our first projects was someone came to us with like 13 targets and was like, can you tell me which of these are the best options? So we did a landscape. We sort of divvied it up and then taught people how to do landscape. At the same time, one of the project where I eventually became a co-founder, sort of Felix Biotechnology, the thing it needed when I was a fellow was it needed someone to write the IND for our phase 1/2 investigator-initiated trial. And I was like, I've never written an IND, but I really want to try to do this. And so the other fellow who had ClinOps experience helped me write that IND by giving me advice. And so we all could sort of rely on each other and go faster and further because we had different backgrounds.
I see. As a scientist, besides obviously raising the funds for starting the company, what do you think are the most challenging aspects of, building a startup as a scientist coming from a PhD background? I think that's one of the questions I'm also really curious about myself.
Yeah. To answer your question really quickly on criteria, this is a broad thing, I think, as advice to folks in general. Find pathways through life that are atypical because that collection of experience will stand out in comparison to many other people who, might be applying for the same role or might be looking to do the same thing, right? Be strategic about it, like figure out how do you weave it into a narrative as I sort of have thought about it in terms of building biotech for space travel. But there's like probably still sub 25% chance I end up doing that, right? It's a guiding thing for me to sort of figure out what do I prioritize in terms of what I do next. In the same way I say, like, all people, everyone who's listening, find your path through life that's sort of less usual, combine different skills. Because I think that's what got me the fellowship. And I think that's what broadly will get fellows, like people interested in you as a fellow or just in general in sort of roles. Now to your question about sort of biotech, the things in biotech to consider, like I think the biggest one that I see folks in R&D or coming from the research side particularly struggle with is accepting that there are non-science reasons for not doing things. Or non-technical reasons for not doing things. And it's something that we all understand in theory, right? It's like, oh yeah, of course there has to be like a business case for this. And you tell the faculty member or somebody this, they nod like, oh yes, we have to come up with a business plan and like come up with the market size. I think the thing that most folks don't internalize is that when you accept that, it means that lots of things that you love dearly or hold as like very important to you should maybe not be products or should maybe not be startups. Like there is not a business case for them. And I think that's probably one of my major beefs with academia. Is like I remember being in academia and being quite frustrated by how the game is played. And one of the things I joked about when I left academia is like, oh, I'll never write grants again. At least that'll be great. Turns out you write SBIRs in industry, so you don't actually get to skip that one. But I did see a lot of self-justification, right, with faculty members who are quite good at getting grants, justify a problem, and get additional grant money. And you really can't do that with a business. Like the market is either there or not. And I think we're jumping forward a little bit. One of my major lessons out of Felix, which was an infectious disease company where people care about this space, people are dying, but because of the way the pricing and market access dynamics work in infectious disease, it is super hard to build a company in the space, flat out, very difficult. And so the takeaway in the end was like, you can't make the market want, like, you can't change the market using a business in most cases, especially if it's a policy or regulatory issue. You can't make the market want what it can't pay for. And so that I think is something that is very hard often for R&D folks to internalize. I think a lot of them associate it with getting axed is part of the problem. Like, oh, in industry, you get laid off every 2 years. And it's like, yeah, it's that they don't have a vendetta against you. It's like the project ended. They decided that was actually not a good idea to go after that indication. It doesn't negate or invalidate the skills that you learned on that work. And like being willing to pivot, especially early, is far better than having spent $50 million in a VC's capital that you aren't now on the hook for. People don't also, I think, should think about it that way. It's like when you raise a large round from a VC, you didn't get free money like that you're going to throw in the air and be like, yeah, you have raised capital with the promise, with the fiduciary duty to a shareholder who you are now responsible for returning 10x to.
Yeah.
That is your responsibility.
Yeah.
So that shouldn't be like, you should celebrate, but that shouldn't be like a we've solved the problem. That is now I am on the hook to deliver or figure out I can't deliver as quickly as possible and give as much of the money as I can back. Okay, cool.
No, you made so many great points, and I have several questions in my head right now. I think ones that I'm curious to ask. I've heard from some people, some say that academia kind of slows down innovation, and for various reasons, right? Maybe because of the bureaucracy, maybe because, the focus is more different, it's more on publications rather than like the own business model. What do you think besides like this, obviously these fellowships, which are not available at every academic institution, right? Like, what do you think people in academia or academic institutions can do to create an environment where scientists can be more like experimental in their approach with entrepreneurship, can actually try things. And you said, sometimes they struggle with pivoting. So what do you think they can do? What steps they can take to, be more comfortable with that?
Okay, got it. So there are 3 things I'll recommend that should be broadly available to most graduate students. Let me double check. Yeah, I think that these are available to most graduate students. First, disclaimer, not all research has to be translational research or like result in an impact. I do have a hot take here that people might disagree with, which is like people appeal to this sort of like, again, golden age of like basic research where no one had any direction, but like everything I've seen in terms of like biggest impact in the world came from somebody in industry paying academia large sums of money to get something done. Like the Haber-Bosch process that makes most of our fertilizer was paid for by Bayer. Things like that. So, I think that we need basic research. We probably don't need it in like the volumes that most people would like to do it in. Things that graduate students or, folks in academia can do writ large. First and foremost, the thing that anyone can do is talk to people in industry for advice. In fact, because of graduate student, postdoc faculty knowledge, a lot of these folks will want to talk to you to get an understanding of your space. So, for example, if you know folks let's say you work in CRISPR. A lot of folks work in CRISPR nowadays. Or with Cas systems for gene editing or for editing of other things, right? And say that you wanted to talk to somebody in industry. Well, because you're at the cutting edge of sort of gene editors or Cas9 editors or Cas editors in general, you could probably find a pretty common ground and get a conversation with somebody at like Intelia or, what's David Liu's base editing company? I'm gonna remember the name after this conversation, but basically like any of those companies, and they're gonna probably want to talk to you as well because, overwhelmingly what I found is people are very happy to give advice. Some selection bias, I'm talking with you on the podcast, but also they will derive value from that as well because they're probably going to ask you something like, okay, what's going on in this space right now? Like, what's academia doing? What's hot? What's interesting? Like, so there's going to be an exchange of value there that isn't necessarily just one way. So that's something anyone can do is like just reach out to someone on LinkedIn. You can start with like a general search, but I'd say very quickly try to understand what the different roles are. Like lots of people reach out to people who are super senior, like reaching out to a CEO is like adding another drop of rain to like a thunderstorm. You can get responses, but chances are that person's not going to have a ton of time to give to you. I say this having done that, having made that mistake. Some are able to respond, but it's often very hard to establish a long-term relationship. People who are like, director, associate director level, senior level, or manager level will have more time, and sort of give you that time of day more frequently. But you just write this quick message. You get 5 free LinkedIn emails. I will actually frequently just directly connect with people and make my blurb fit into 300 characters because the LinkedIn mails have a hardcore spam filter and a lot of people just don't read them. So it's like, hey, here's who I am. Here, half a sentence. I am contacting you because I want to speak with experts in XYZ, or I'm trying to learn this. And then I will sometimes be like, hey, I'm happy to buy you a coffee in return. Very rarely do I actually buy someone a coffee. In fact, some people have been like, wait, we're in different cities. How do you plan to do that? It's like, oh, I'll take DoorDash to Starbucks. I'll, do a drone drop. They think that's funny as hell. So that is a great way to get conversations with folks. And again, I think one thing to do in this situation is always try to return value to them, right? Like they gave you time. Spend the time to write the thank you note. Spend the time to, I always ask at the end of every single one of my conversations, or try to, what are you looking for? Are you looking for talk to somebody, learn some information, figure something out? Chances are I can't help you, right? But maybe I know someone who can help you, or maybe I can help you and I just need to like find the right person in my network to connect you with, or I can answer that thing. I think that gesture goes a long way, and like again, exchanging value in some way, so it's not just like you taking up someone's time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first thing. Anyone can do that as long as you've got a LinkedIn account. Make a LinkedIn account, please. It's another one. We'll say that's 1.5. Make a LinkedIn account, populate it, put a dang picture on it. The second thing I think anyone can do is anyone can get involved with like a tech transfer office or some kind of local business. Like it doesn't necessarily even have to be biotech. I think this is one thing people get really like hung up on is like, oh, I work in biotech and therefore I must use my biotech skill. Chances are there's local business that probably just wants business help, right? And you're getting into this gray area now where you will be doing work and that business may or may not be able to pay you. So, weigh that accordingly on your time. But in a lot of places, you can just walk up to your tech transfer office and be like, hey, I want to volunteer or get involved in some way. And that is like an amazing way to sort of get started. And then the third way I think almost everyone has access to, actually there's sort of two things in here are sort of more guided programs. So one of them is consulting. So most groups, most institutions have a consulting club of some kind, or they have another institution nearby that has a consulting club. It's a great way to get involved. There are case competitions. Great way to get started. No, you will have no idea what you're doing when you get started. Nobody else does either. And so yeah, I did my first case competition. We did horribly. I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. So yeah, that's a great one. And the second one is I-Corps. So I think there are regional I-Corps that now cover the entirety of the United States. It's a program put on by the National Science Foundation, based on Steve Blank's lean startup methodologies. So if you're very specifically interested in startups, it's a great place to go because it will teach you a lot of the interview skills that we did not learn. I remember, like, I will admit I was one of the people who do this, and like, yes, humanities, like, that's a cool thing to study, and then you go get a real job. All the people who do humanities and social scientists know how to interview people. Really useful skill to learn. Just question formulation. So you'll learn that in I-Corps. You learn how to find the right people. You learn how to understand how sort of buying decisions get made. So you can go and apply for I-Corps, or you can go get involved in consulting clubs and get some more sort of guided help on these things.
I see. And how do you spell iCorps?
I-CORPS.
CRPs. Okay. Okay. Got it. And
Really quickly, if your PI has a grant through the NSF,
mhm.
or I think now through the NIH has their own version of this program, you could participate in I-Corps. A lot of them come with participation things. You have to sort of figure out the grant whether or not there is some allowance for it. But you could poke your PI and be like, hey, is this related? Can you talk to the PO and ask? And then you'll get the experience to do this with your PI.
I see. I see. You mentioned, well, first of all, very informative. Thank you so much, Dr. Ma. You mentioned a couple of things. One of them, you mentioned VCs a lot, right? And VCs are becoming, and especially I feel like recently have become like this one of the more appealing parts of like the finance, especially because you don't really need a traditional finance background to get into VC, right? And VCs can focus on many other things, but I feel like biotech VCs are more specialized and usually need an advanced degree to get into biotech, and it definitely requires like more knowledge of the field and more expertise. So first of all, what's your opinion of VCs? How do you think they help innovation? Do you think there are parts that you don't really like about how VCs operate? And another saying I'm curious to know, it's very kind of, it's, there's no really, like, let's say if you think about private equity, you do investment banking, you go into private equity. There's more like, it's obvious, you can find information on the net. VCs are more kind of like dark area. You don't really know how to break into VCs. So how do you think a scientist, somebody in a PhD, or maybe not in a PhD, can make themselves kind of, competitive for a VC position? How do you think they can land a VC position? And yeah, just anything really you want to share your thoughts and opinions on VCs and etc. Feel free to do
Yeah.
so.
I mean, this is slightly dangerous because you're talking to someone who's a founder who begs for money from VCs.
Yeah,
So I'm
be
not going to say
careful. Yeah.
anything negative. But I will say, so like I talked to a ton of people in graduate school who want to go into VC specifically, and I find that very interesting because it is again playing above, like you're not in the game. You allocate funds and you have maybe a little more control over a company because you've given them cash,
Mhm.
but you don't, I think, learn as much as if you were to go directly into a company. And many of the things that you learn in VC, I could be wrong. I haven't ever taken a VC role.
Mhm.
I've been asked to do sort of technical advice, diligence, weigh in on your feedback, range of things from VCs. But I myself have not had an official role. But I always get the feeling that it's like you learn a lot of the skills overlapping with consulting. Like you're often doing a due diligence. Maybe the one thing you don't do in consulting is you don't write an investment memo. But you put together the slide deck, which is functionally an investment memo. And so I do feel like there's a lot of overlap there, with the exception that most of what you do in consulting is with large established companies, or large biotech, pharma, and you're dealing with much earlier players with far more unknowns and a lot more risks in VC. So like that gives you an idea of the difference between the two industries, but I do think that there's a lot of overlap between them, and VC is one of the exits you get from consulting regularly. Sort of pharma, like large pharma, commercial strategy roles, etc. VC, there's a couple other roles, like some folks go into private equity, some of us become founders. That's, again, I mentioned earlier, consulting closes no doors. In many ways, it doesn't. And so I find it interesting, and I want to ask people, it's like, why is it that you want to go into VC? And often it's because you feel like, when I've pushed people, it's like, oh, I feel like I will learn a lot and get to see a lot, but I won't have to fail. Is often the feeling I get from talking to people, and I'm like, well, the failure is the really useful part, because you can make the recommendation, but I think until you've been in like the shoes of the founder, which is a very sort of Andreessen Horowitz style philosophy, you don't have full line of sight into what is going through the founder's head when they're making a decision. And so you always have this sort of blind spot about how the startups you are giving advice, giving money to are actually operating. So I'll start with sort of saying that about sort of getting a VC role. On the technical side, like I said, consulting provides a great background. Folks that go into VC, one of the common pathways is you provide help as an internship, externship for free with people already, because VC is a very relationship-driven system. Generally, all of startups are very relationship-driven, which I think gets underemphasized by graduate schools because I think, erroneously overemphasize merit, scientific merit, paper publication, these other things that we view as objective. But the ability to make a promise and keep your promise is probably also very critical, and we undervalue that. And the ability to do sort of like a trading of value or trading of favors, right? It's like, I help you with this. Next week, I need help with something, and you happen to have the resources to help me with that. Again, like, very much about the network. So it is, everyone says the cynical phrase, it's about who you know. I'd say it's probably not just who you know, but who you have built a relationship with where they can vouch for your credibility and capability. Because again, in a world where 100 people apply for a role, you have two barriers, one of which is the person applying a psychopath? And by knowing that person, right, it's like you've de-risked that part. And the next one is like, how well can they do the job compared to some hypothetical person in the pool? And if they know both those things, you have a much higher chance of getting a role. I think another thing that you can do that, or like gets undervalued, is go work in pharma in these sort of internship type roles. So Genentech does this sort of 2-year rotation program where you actually rotate through like all the divisions or 5 divisions in Genentech, right? You'll do commercial strategy, you'll do clinical operations. You get to see the inside of Genentech. It's super cool. I wish I had done this. That will probably provide you with both the connections and the understanding of how an organization works at that scale. That will, again, make you very valuable to a VC, to private equity even, like when you're allocating capital, because again, you've been in the game, you've seen what happens. So that, I think, is another sort of good path into VC. I do say that very few people get VC roles directly out of grad school. It does happen. It is not super common because a lot of people don't yet have you might have the technical expertise, but you haven't built the business expertise, I'd say, to do the job at the level that the VCs would want, because a lot of the time it feels like VCs have infinite time, right? Because they're placing the capital. They're like, oh, we'll talk to you tomorrow. That, ask some other VC folks about this, but I get the feeling it's less and less the case. Probably a little more now that, the market's gone down, but it used to be, it's like, okay, you've got 2 weeks to do diligence on this company because I got a term sheet from somebody else. Good luck, go, right? And so it's not like you have infinite time to learn on that job. So it's like, how do you get those skills to make a bridge between this and VC? Does that make sense?
Yes. Very interesting. Very interesting. Actually, from a founder's perspective, when you work with these VCs, like, what do you think they really focus on when, they're assessing your company, your idea? I mean, especially when in the early stages, when it's essentially just an idea and a person, right? You don't have a product, you don't really have anything. So how do they assess, and what do they look at? What the metrics they really focus on when they are assessing your idea and decide to give you, funds?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Javid. We could do an entire sort of segment on this if you want to do a follow-up. At a high level, we can divide like funding into, like, let's say super early stage, sort of early stage, and then we'll go to mid stage.
Mm-hmm.
And then transparently, like, knowledge beyond the mid stage, I don't have a ton of expertise there.
Mm-hmm.
So I probably shouldn't talk too much to that.
Mm-hmm.
But the VCs in like very early versus mid stage are looking at slightly different things. The evaluation that they're making is, am I going to make a 10x return on the money I put in most cases? Because up until mid stage, that's about how much money they need to make to make their fund profitable. And there are articles you can look up online about this. It's like, how do VC returns and carry and all this stuff work? And it's basically a very simple math of like, here is the amount of money that you give a company. Here is the likelihood that they're going to get you any money back. And then here is the amount of money they need to make back for you to make a 2 to 3x return, I think is something like that, 2 to 5x. And so the math is quite simple there. That's the question they're pretty frequently asking, with the exception of some angels who very much are mission or like person focused, right? So it's like more about I love the idea, I love like the passion that you have. And you'll notice that the 10x return thing says nothing about your product and market. It's because a lot of them, especially early on, will expect you to make a pivot, expect things to change substantially. And so it is often a bet on the team and not necessarily like a specific product in place. It's probably more of a bet on like, how good are these people? How good do I think these people are at doing an assessment and getting the resources they need to then go to the next step? So I said earlier, we're going to sort of divide this into 3 sections. Well, actually, taking a step back, first thing, maybe this happens to some people. It's never happened to me. You don't really get investment on the first pitch. It's not like Silicon Valley where maybe it is for some people. Again, it's like where you come in and you like abuse the VCs and the VCs then just really want to work with. I've not had this experience. I've always started by asking VCs for advice, because chances are when you come to them with your first pitch, it's going to get torn apart and they're going to have tons of things you didn't think of. And it will be a like, oh, wow, okay, I don't actually know if I even have a company after this discussion or a startup idea. Like go back, sort of make iterations, ask for advice. Cadence probably varies, but like 3 months to 6 months. It could be shorter if you know that you feel like that person really seemed interested and invested in you. And demonstrate improvement, because you're demonstrating you can take advice, right? It's like, okay, I got this feedback. I made this change, or I have answered this question that I did not have an answer to 2 months ago. Hey, can we talk again? Like now I'm thinking about this next step. And it's that asking for advice thing that has been very helpful. At some point, you do need to transition to asking for money, but I think most people will ask that question too early. Expecting, okay, I'm going to go into this first pitch and get a nice $3 million check out of it, and then I'm not have to worry, like, push button, get bacon style. So that I think doesn't happen. Now going to the sort of super early stage and the middle stage. Super early stage, you have your angel investors. Check size could be as small as a couple grand, all the way up to like a couple $100,000, depending on who it is. These people are often investing very strongly on you or the mission, right? It's like they really believe in this problem. They really believe in what you're doing. And so that investment is an investment in a concept or you as a person, right? And it's often, I think it's best done if it's tied to a specific milestone. Like, we don't know X. I need this much money to show X. And this is the thing most likely to, in the near term, kill the project. Can you give me X to go do this work? And then if we do, great, we have a company. And if not, then okay, let's write that off as a loss investment wise. But we don't spend additional money on it. But it should always be that really hard thing to do, right? Or like not hard as in like difficult to do, but hard as in like this is make or break. Often it's done on a safe, so a simple agreement for equity, doesn't value the company. There are safe forms you can download online. It's like this part of the process, like lawyers will sometimes, but not always even get involved. You move to early stage, and this is like so that can sometimes be your pre-seed. You move to early stage and now have seed round. And so this is usually you've got some decent de-risking proof there. Sometimes you can go straight here, particularly if you're spinning out of academia, because you may have done some of that translational work in the lab. And then the company is now evaluated more on its business potential, right? Like, here are the milestones. Again, what are the biggest things that you can afford to do that will kill your company? You obviously cannot afford to run a clinical trial right off the bat. And the FDA is not going to let you do that anyway. But they're like, does it kill rats, right? Is this going to be toxic? Or like, hey, this thing kind of works, but not great. We want to optimize it to make the binding affinity higher or make it more soluble or make it cell penetrant. So it's that where you're like, here is what I will do. And here's how much it's going to cost. And here's how much equity I'll give you in return. And then you can have these little add-ons where it's like, okay, well, we could do this. And if there's someone else who fills up this part of the round, an extra 600K, we can do these other 2 things, which will set us up even better. So like that's the thing that you do if you had a variable round size. And then you get to sort of the later sort of middle stage, and Broadly, these are the same in tech and biotech, these first parts. You have a divergence in sort of the middle stage, where in seed stage, you're expected to sort of figure out your product market fit, or like maybe in Series A. By the time you're getting to middle stage, it's like we've hit it, we're generating revenue, or we've just got to scale the team, like, turn the crank, hire more sales reps, do something, and then product sales will grow. So it's typically your middle stage round in tech. In biotech and in platforms, it's very different. So in biotech, it's traditionally Series A, Series B. Often it's like, okay, we're going into clinic. So you've shown that all this stuff. It doesn't kill rats. It doesn't kill monkeys, dogs. It shows efficacy in the disease. You've got a good indication you should take this into humans. Hey, can we raise Series A or Series B and take this into a clinical trial, like first in human? Platform is a little more confusing, but is often one step behind asset, or that biotech one. So it's off. Like I've seen it as a Series A should be like, okay, we have our first asset, an idea of what we should do, and we're going to do all the preclinical work with the round that you pay us, as well as continue building the platform to get the second asset. And then it's Series B or ideally Series B, I would guess, maybe Series C, where you get the money to run the trial. But that gives you an idea of like, okay, here are the different ways people think about investment. At that stage, though, you should have pretty substantial de-risking in terms of money making. Series A companies will still fail, but I do feel like there's a big difference in terms of preparedness of the team, in terms of business knowledge, market opportunity, development plan, whether it's tech or biotech, in the Series A round, and that's sort of like the valley of death for most startups. Also, a startup dying is not a bad thing. Like, many things should not be startups. The valley of death exists for a reason, and in this case, the valley of death may not be something you actually want to fix. Lots of people talk about this, so
That's
anyway.
no, that's so fascinating. It's when you get a funding, right? Like, oh my God, I have so many questions. How do
We
you
don't
how do
have
you
a conversation. It's like
how,
fine.
how do you like negotiate that? How much equity you're gonna give to
Oh,
the VCs? Or another thing is, how do you allocate those funds? Whether it's the research, whether it's like growing the number of the headcount, right? Or like getting new like the facility, whatever. And another thing is, in your opinion, what are the most dangerous parts of that process? Like when it's most likely to fail, or when it's most like, because average age of, I think, the drug development takes like 10 to 15 years before bringing it to the market, right? And all of biotech companies fail. So like, it, like when do you think like are the most dangerous moments, and when do you really need like a lot of funding, and how do you allocate
yeah.
that funding, and how do you negotiate the equity for that funding, you know?
Yeah. Okay. This is probably my last question, then I have to sign off and go to my dinner thing. Um, so I'll take this as in two parts. One of them is like the most dangerous time is pretty much always uh, everything before like, yeah, even your phase 3 study, there's tons of stuff that fails. You can find statistics online of asset failure. So I don't have to sort of walk you through that part, but I will say that like most things in biotech fail because biology is not predictive. Like we don't have decent predictive systems for biology, and that's not a criticism of all of the biologists, biotechnologists, and drug hunters that have come before us. More of a biology is really complicated. And so that's part of one of the reasons I co-founded and became head of BD at Deep Origin, was because we want to build systems that are going to be more predictive of biology and take that success rate from 10%, 14% out of phase 1 or entering phase 1 to actual approval. So the reason it's always, whatever time it is currently is the most risky time is that every single program fails for a different reason. You'll see some trends. So like in cancer, a lot of things will fail in phase 1 because, hey, you're killing cells. It turns out the toxicity is one of the big things you worry about.
Yeah.
And so you can sort of see in historical trends, depending on the disease you're going after, okay, what is the most dangerous time? But I can't sort of give you a generalist
Yeah.
most dangerous time. The other things you sort of talked about how the allocation works. Allocation of resources is probably something I learned a little bit of this at iGEM, as well as when I was at how they write sort of seeing budget spreadsheets. Working on your PI with a grant, or the grants office with a grant, great way to also see how the university allocates this and be like, oh, okay, this is roughly what it takes. This is the reason why, as salty as people are about like biotech having experience or needing to have experience in a biotech startup, it goes quite a long ways. So it's like, okay, I can now cost out and sort of figure out the duration of a project. Like, how long is this going to take and for how much money? That often comes by experience. And so you either have that experience or you work with someone who has that experience, be it they're the CEO or chief medical officer of your company, or they're an advisor to your company. You're paying a consulting fee or part of your equity too. That is really valuable. Get it. Don't try to fly on your own, because I've seen lots of decks where it's like, yeah, we're going to go through preclinical in a year and have the IND filed, the molecule be optimized, then we're going to go into patients a year and a half from now. And I'm like, no, it's like maybe.
Yeah.
But I don't see any evidence that is that you're deviating from the norm so much in terms of capability that this will actually happen. Very valuable to do. So then, how much equity do you get or give up for the money that you get? There are some sort of general rules you can look up again online. I'm trying to remember what they are now, but it's roughly like a quarter to a third of the company, depending on like the risk, the current state of the market. It's going to be worse now because again, funding has been down. People are really skittish. Interest rates have been high, and when interest rates are high, you can make a ton of money just by letting money sit in a bank account, right? Really hard value prop. It was like, okay, you should go invest that in a higher risk biotech. So like that is going to impact things. But generally, you're sort of asking folks for advice, talking to other folks in the space. Again, this is why it's important to have advisors or people who are more seasoned. And it's like, this is a fair deal. This is not a fair deal.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's generally how it gets done. There's probably, especially now that there's a ton of data on this from the hot days of biotech, a lot less likely someone gets taken for a ride in either direction.
Yeah.
Which is bad. You don't ever want that to happen because they will find out.
Dr. Ma, you've been extremely informative, and I got kind of off track because we had such a interesting, and I really hope we can have another episode at some point again, because you just have so much wisdom in this in this sphere, in this area. But I took all of your time, so thank you. And any final words of advice, wisdom before we end our episode?
Let's see. If you're a tech software developer, we're hiring at Deep Origin, www.deeporigin.com. We're looking for engineers. We're also looking for product managers. We have a few different product verticals we're working on. I have to plug that in, Javid.
Can you just quickly tell us, Deep Origin is focused on making what exactly?
So we are building predictive systems in biology with the vision of, can you create in the future in silico systems that actually predict safety and efficacy of drug with a high degree of certainty. We're starting with sort of three key areas that you would need to build these models. One of them is the models themselves, right? So like the software or like the predictive software, particularly we're doing in molecular dynamics docking. We're actually building a protein dynamics engine for protein-protein interaction. And then the second part, besides models that you need, is to wrap here. This, like, from the ground up, we want to build working models of living systems. So like from atom-atom interaction, and then you go to coarse grain modeling, and then you go to whole cell systems and intercellular interactions. That's how we think you should be testing drugs in the future, because that you can do a lot faster, a lot more affordably. And then there's never a world in which you won't do experiments, but they actually work 90% of the time, instead of my PCR failed for like the 50th time, or the cell assay failed. The odds are not great, even when you're your fifth year PhD. So that's the first part. Second part is you need data to feed these things. And so how do you build an experimental infrastructure that can take in the data and metadata for these things and use them to build models? And the third is analysis infrastructure. So computational infrastructure to allow on-the-fly analysis, both automated and sort of custom for the informatician, with the perspective that everyone in the future probably will code to some degree, and you should give them a flexible sandbox to play in. And those three things combined will help us build sort of the future predictive systems of biology. That's what I work on now. It's wonderful fun. My co-founder and our primary founder was one of the Oculus founders, Michael.
Wow.
And so he has been sort of a huge inspiration, and has been, there's a sort of tech bro misconception. There's a tech bro thing that gets bandied about, like, okay, tech is going to solve biology now. It's like, I have actually been like very pleasantly surprised that like he has been so thoughtful and aware that, biology is complicated and hard. And as a tech person coming into the space, there's lots to learn. And so it's
Mhm.
been fantastic so far to work with him. I look forward to hopefully many years, either prediction or bust. So
Yeah,
anyway,
and you guys are hiring, so that's good. I'll definitely make sure I'll let my friends know too. And I guess
yep.
any final words of advice and wisdom?
I have a sample size of 1, so keep collecting data, whether that's you, Javid, directly, whether that's your audience.
Mhm.
Keep asking people for their experiences,
Mhm.
because that's probably one of the fastest ways to learn and not make mistakes other people have made. So
Thank you so much, Dr. Ma. Genuinely, really appreciate your time, and hopefully we'll talk again.
yeah, you're very welcome. Have a wonderful evening.
You too.
Enjoy the hopefully not too cold New Haven weather.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.